On January 10th, 1475, in the frozen hills of northeastern Moldavia, Stephen the Great stood with 40,000 men watching 120,000 Ottoman soldiers approach through the snow. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful military force in the world, had come to conquer Moldavia and punish Stephen for his defiance. The Ottoman army was 3 times larger than Stephen's force and included elite Janissaries, Sipahi cavalry and Akıncı raiders who had terrorized Europe for decades. The Ottomans expected an easy victory. Moldavia was a small principality, poor and isolated, sandwiched between the expanding Ottoman Empire and hostile neighbors. Stephen the Great, ruler of Moldavia for 17 years, had refused to pay tribute to Sultan Mehmed the Second, the conqueror of Constantinople. Now, Mehmed had sent an army to destroy him. But Stephen was not a typical medieval prince waiting passively to be conquered. He was one of the greatest military commanders of his era, a tactical genius who understood that he could not defeat the Ottomans in open battle on flat ground. So he chose his battlefield carefully. Near the town of Vaslui, the terrain was hilly, forested, and cut by streams that had frozen and thawed repeatedly, creating muddy ground that would slow the Ottoman cavalry. Stephen positioned his army on high ground with forests protecting his flanks. He forced the Ottomans to attack uphill through mud, snow, and narrow defiles, where their numerical superiority meant nothing. Then he unleashed a counterattack with such fury that the Ottoman army disintegrated. In the next 12 hours, perhaps 40 to 45,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed, the largest Ottoman defeat in decades and one of the greatest Christian victories in medieval history. The Moldavian pursuit was merciless. Fleeing Ottomans were hunted through forests and frozen rivers for days. Many froze to death trying to escape. Others drowned crossing icy streams. The survivors who reached Ottoman territory brought news of a catastrophe that shocked Constantinople and thrilled Christian Europe. Pope Sixtus IV called Stephen Atleta Christi, the champion of Christ. And in the frozen hell of Vaslui, 40,000 Moldavians proved that Ottoman invincibility was a myth. To understand why the Battle of Vaslui was so significant, you must understand the Ottoman Empire's power in 1475. Sultan Mehmed the Second, who had conquered Constantinople in 1453 and ended the Byzantine Empire, was at the height of his reign. The Ottoman Empire controlled Anatolia, the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, and was expanding into Hungary and Wallachia. Ottoman armies had proven themselves superior to Christian forces repeatedly. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry corps of slave soldiers trained from childhood, were considered the finest infantry in the world. The Sipahi cavalry, mounted warriors who received land grants in exchange for military service, were numerous and well-equipped. The Akıncı light cavalry specialized in raiding, burning, and terrorizing enemy populations. Ottoman tactics combined firepower from early guns and composite bows with disciplined infantry formations and massed cavalry charges. They had conquered Christian kingdoms that were larger, richer, and better fortified than Moldavia. Mehmed expected that crushing Stephen would be routine. He was wrong, because he underestimated both Stephen's military genius and the determination of the Moldavian people to resist. Stephen the Great had ruled Moldavia since 1457, taking the throne at age 24. Over 17 years, he had transformed Moldavia from a weak principality into a military power that could defend itself against all neighbors: Poland, Hungary, the Ottomans, and the Tatars. Stephen was a brilliant tactician who understood that Moldavia's survival depended on avoiding conventional battles where larger enemies would crush him through numbers. Instead, he used defensive tactics, terrain advantages, scorched earth, and mobile warfare. He fortified key positions with wooden palisades and earthworks. He trained his soldiers in disciplined fighting. He used light cavalry for raids and reconnaissance, and most importantly, he chose when and where to fight. When the Ottomans invaded in December 1474, Stephen did not meet them at the border. He withdrew, burned crops and villages to deny the Ottomans supplies, and waited for winter to worsen the invaders' situation. He chose the battlefield at Vaslui specifically because the terrain nullified Ottoman advantages. The hills, forests and muddy ground prevented the Ottomans from deploying their full force effectively. It was a masterclass in defensive warfare. The Ottoman invasion force that crossed into Moldavia in December 1474 was commanded by Hadim Süleyman Pasha, an experienced general and beylerbey of Rumelia. The exact size of his army is disputed. Ottoman sources minimize it, Christian sources exaggerate it, but modern historians estimate between 60,000 and 120,000 soldiers. Even the conservative estimate made this one of the largest Ottoman armies fielded in the Balkans. The force included approximately 10,000 to 15,000 Janissaries, the elite infantry armed with yataghan swords, composite bows, and early arquebuses. These were professional soldiers with iron discipline, trained since childhood after being taken from Christian families as the Devshirme tribute. The Janissaries were the shock troops of the Ottoman army, used to break enemy formations and hold key positions. Supporting them were approximately 30,000 to 40,000 Sipahi cavalry, the backbone of Ottoman military power. These were mounted warriors in mail and plate armor, armed with lances, sabers, and composite bows. They received land grants called timars in exchange for military service and were expected to bring retainers. They were experienced, well-equipped, and skilled in mounted archery and shock combat. Additionally, the army included 20,000 to 30,000 Akıncı light cavalry, raiders and scouts, who ranged ahead of the main force, burning villages and terrorizing populations. There were also irregulars, Christian vassals from Serbia and Bulgaria, forced to fight for the Ottomans, and support personnel. It was a massive multi-ethnic army representing the power of the Ottoman Empire. Stephen's Moldavian army numbered approximately 40,000 men, a force he had been assembling and training for years, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. The core of his army was perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 professional soldiers. Boyars, Moldavian nobles with their retinues, mounted warriors in mail armor armed with lances, sabers and bows. These were experienced fighters who had served in Stephen's previous campaigns against Tatars, Hungarians and Poles. Supporting them were approximately 15,000 to 20,000 infantry levies, peasants and townsmen armed with spears, axes and crossbows. These were not professional soldiers, but they were defending their homeland against an invader known for brutality, which gave them motivation. Stephen also had approximately 5,000 to 8,000 light cavalry, mobile horsemen used for scouting, raiding, and pursuing broken enemies. Additionally, he had support from Wallachian and Hungarian contingents, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 men total, sent by allies who feared Ottoman expansion. Stephen's army was outnumbered 3-1 in the most optimistic estimates, but it had crucial advantages. It was fighting on chosen ground, defending its homeland, led by a brilliant commander and motivated by survival. The Ottomans were invading in winter, far from their supply bases, in hostile territory, and overconfident. The Ottoman advance through Moldavia in late December 1474 and early January 1475 was slowed by Stephen's scorched earth tactics. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock driven away or slaughtered. The Ottomans found no food, no fodder for their horses, and no shelter. Winter in Moldavia is brutal. Temperatures below freezing, snow, ice and mud when it thaws. The Ottoman army, massive and unwieldy, struggled to supply itself. Foraging parties were ambushed by Moldavian light cavalry, Stragglers were killed. Morale declined. But Suleiman Pasha pressed forward, believing that once he brought Stephen to battle, Ottoman numbers would prevail. He reached the area near Vaslui in early January 1475 and discovered that Stephen had positioned his army on high ground with forests on the flanks. The Ottomans would have to attack uphill across difficult terrain. Suleiman should have recognized this as a trap, but he was confident in Ottoman superiority. He deployed his army and prepared to attack. The battlefield at Vaslui was Stephen's masterpiece of defensive positioning. He placed his army on a ridge with steep slopes, forcing attackers to climb under fire. The ground between the Ottoman positions and the Moldavian ridge was cut by small streams and gullies, frozen and thawed repeatedly, creating muddy, icy ground that would slow cavalry. To the left and right, forests prevented wide flanking maneuvers and provided cover for Moldavian ambushes. Stephen positioned his infantry in the center behind wooden palisades and earthworks hastily constructed. These were not permanent fortifications, but field defenses, sharpened stakes, ditches and barriers that would break up Ottoman charges. His archers and crossbowmen were placed to shoot downhill at attacking forces. His cavalry was held in reserve on the flanks, ready to counterattack once the Ottomans were engaged. It was a defensive position designed to nullify Ottoman numerical superiority by forcing them into a narrow killing ground where they couldn't deploy their full force. The Ottomans would have to attack uphill, through mud, under fire, against prepared defenses, while their flanks were threatened by forests full of Moldavian troops. It was a tactical nightmare for the attackers, but Suleiman Pasha, perhaps underestimating Stephen or overconfident in Ottoman power, ordered the attack. The battle began on the morning of January 10, 1475, when Ottoman forces advanced toward the Moldavian positions. The Akıncı light cavalry attacked first, attempting to scout the defenses and provoke a response. They rode toward the Moldavian lines, shooting arrows, trying to draw Stephen's cavalry into a chase that would break his defensive formation. Stephen refused to take the bait. His orders were to hold position and let the Ottomans exhaust themselves attacking uphill. The Akıncı, finding no easy target, withdrew. Then Suleiman ordered a general assault. The Sipahi cavalry advanced, thousands of mounted warriors in mail and plate armor, with lances lowered, attempting to charge uphill and break the Moldavian center. But the ground betrayed them. The slope was steep and muddy. Horses struggled to maintain footing. The charge slowed to a labored advance, Moldavian archers and crossbowmen, shooting downhill from prepared positions, poured arrows and bolts into the struggling cavalry. Men and horses fell. The charge broke apart before reaching the Moldavian lines. The Sipahi withdrew in disorder, having achieved nothing but casualties. Suleiman tried again. He committed the Janissaries, his elite infantry, supported by irregular infantry. Approximately 10,000 to 15,000 Janissaries advanced uphill in disciplined formations, shields raised, composite bows and arquebuses returning fire against the Moldavian defenders. The Janissaries were legendary for their discipline and had broken many enemy lines through sheer determination. But at Vaslui, they faced terrain that defeated even elite troops. The uphill advance through mud exhausted them. Moldavian archers shot from behind palisades, causing steady casualties. When the Janissaries finally reached the Moldavian defenses, they were met by infantry with spears and axes fighting from behind barriers. The melee was brutal, Janissaries trying to break through the palisades, Moldavians defending desperately. The fighting lasted for hours, with neither side gaining clear advantage. But the Janissaries, attacking uphill against prepared defenses, could not break through. They withdrew, bloodied and exhausted. Ottoman casualties were mounting, but the Moldavian line held. By early afternoon, the Ottoman army was in trouble. Multiple attacks had failed. Casualties were heavy. The troops were exhausted from fighting uphill in mud and snow. Morale was declining, and then Stephen launched his counterattack. He had been waiting for this moment, when the Ottomans were disordered, exhausted, and psychologically defeated. Stephen unleashed his cavalry from both flanks. Approximately 10,000 Moldavian and allied horsemen charged out of the forests on the left and right, hitting the Ottoman army from the sides. The Ottomans, who had been focused on the frontal assault, were caught off guard by the flank attacks. The Moldavian cavalry smashed into Ottoman formations, causing panic. Simultaneously, Stephen ordered his center infantry to advance from their defensive positions and attack the withdrawing Ottomans. The Moldavian army, which had been defending passively for hours, suddenly became aggressive. The psychological impact was devastating. The Ottomans, who had been attacking unsuccessfully all day, now found themselves attacked from 3 directions. Discipline began to break. Units started to retreat without orders, and once the retreat began, it became a rout. The Ottoman army disintegrated. Thousands of soldiers fled the battlefield, abandoning weapons and equipment. The Moldavian cavalry pursued ruthlessly. Stephen had ordered no mercy. The Ottomans had come to destroy Moldavia, and now they would pay for their arrogance. The pursuit turned into a massacre. Moldavian horsemen hunted fleeing Ottomans through the forests, cutting them down from behind. Ottoman soldiers tried to cross frozen rivers and broke through the ice, drowning in freezing water weighed down by armor and equipment. Others froze to death overnight, lost in the forests without shelter or supplies. Some fought back in small groups and were overwhelmed. The Moldavians showed no mercy. This was revenge for decades of Ottoman raids, enslavements, and terror. The slaughter continued for hours. By nightfall, thousands of Ottomans lay dead on the battlefield and in the surrounding forests. The survivors fled toward the Ottoman border, pursued by Moldavian cavalry for days. Many more died during the retreat from exhaustion, cold, and continued attacks. The casualty figures at Vaslui are staggering even by medieval standards. Contemporary sources, both Christian and Ottoman, agree that Ottoman losses were catastrophic, though exact numbers vary. Christian sources claim 40,000 to 45,000 Ottomans killed, with some claiming even higher. Ottoman sources, which typically minimize defeats, acknowledge massive losses but don't provide specific numbers. Modern historians estimate that the Ottomans lost approximately 40 to 45,000 dead out of an army of 60,000 to 120,000, representing 37 to 75% casualties depending on which army size estimate is used. Even the conservative estimates make Vaslui one of the deadliest Ottoman defeats in history. Among the dead were thousands of Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman military, whose loss was particularly damaging. Many Sipahi cavalry were killed, representing not just military losses but economic losses, since each Sipahi held a land grant. The Akıncı raiders, who had terrorized Christian populations for years, were decimated. Moldavian casualties were comparatively light, perhaps 4,000 to 8,000 killed and wounded, roughly 10 to 20% of Stephen's army. This casualty ratio, approximately 5 to 1 in Stephen's favor, reflects both the defensive advantages of his position and the effectiveness of his tactics. The immediate strategic consequences of Vaslui were profound. The Ottoman invasion was completely destroyed. The survivors who reached Ottoman territory brought news of a disaster that shocked Sultan Mehmed the Second and the entire Ottoman court. The invincible Ottoman military had been humiliated by a small Christian principality. Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople and considered himself the new Caesar, had to accept that Moldavia could not be conquered easily. The Ottoman expansion into Eastern Europe was halted. Wallachia, which had been wavering between Ottoman and Hungarian influence, gained confidence to resist Ottoman pressure. Hungary and Poland, which had feared inevitable Ottoman conquest, saw that the Ottomans could be defeated. The psychological impact across Christian Europe was immense. For decades, Ottoman victories had seemed unstoppable. Now, Stephen the Great had proven that with good tactics, defensive terrain, and determined soldiers, even a smaller force could destroy an Ottoman army. Pope Sixtus IV, hearing news of the victory, sent Stephen a letter calling him Athleta Christi, the champion of Christ, and comparing him to ancient Roman heroes. Venice, Hungary, Poland, and the Papal States all sent congratulations and offers of alliance. Stephen became a Christian hero, the one man who had stood against the Ottoman tide and won. For Moldavia, Vaslui secured independence for another generation. Stephen the Great would rule until 1504, 30 years after Vaslui, successfully defending Moldavia against Ottomans, Hungarians, Poles, and Tatars. He would fight approximately 47 battles in his lifetime and reportedly won 38, an extraordinary record. But Vaslui remained his greatest victory, the battle that proved Moldavia could not be conquered. Stephen used the prestige from Vaslui to strengthen his position. He built fortresses, monasteries, and churches, many of which still stand in modern Romania and Moldova. He reformed the Moldavian military and administration. He maintained Moldavia as an independent Orthodox Christian state in a region where the Ottomans, Catholics, and Orthodox powers all competed for dominance. Vaslui was the foundation of his legend and the reason he is called Stephen the Great in Romanian and Moldovan history. But the victory at Vaslui did not end the Ottoman threat. Mehmed the Second was humiliated but not defeated. He sent another army in 1476, personally leading this time with an even larger force, estimated at 150,000 to 200,000 men. Stephen could not face this overwhelming force in open battle and withdrew, using scorched earth tactics again. The Ottomans ravaged Moldavia but could not bring Stephen to decisive battle. Eventually, Mehmed withdrew, having achieved nothing but destruction. The Ottomans would return repeatedly over the following decades, but they never successfully conquered Moldavia during Stephen's lifetime. Vaslui had shown that conquest was too costly. The Ottomans eventually reduced Moldavia to vassal status, forcing tribute payments but allowing autonomy, which was the best outcome Stephen could hope for given the vast disparity in resources between Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire. Vaslui bought Moldavia time and freedom, even if it couldn't secure permanent independence against an empire that would eventually dominate the region. The military lessons of Vaslui were significant. Stephen demonstrated that defensive tactics, terrain selection, and disciplined troops could overcome numerical superiority. His use of forests to protect flanks, uphill positioning to slow attacks, field fortifications to strengthen defensive lines, and cavalry held in reserve for counterattack became a model for outnumbered defenders. Vaslui showed that even elite troops like the Janissaries could be defeated if forced to attack across difficult terrain against prepared positions. It proved that winter warfare favored defenders who knew the ground and could supply themselves, while invaders struggled with weather and logistics. The battle also demonstrated the importance of morale and motivation. The Moldavians were fighting for survival, which made them fight harder than Ottoman soldiers who were far from home on a mission of conquest they didn't necessarily believe in. These lessons would be studied by military commanders for generations. The human cost of Vaslui was concentrated among the Ottoman army, but it was immense. 40 to 45,000 Ottoman dead meant that tens of thousands of families across Anatolia and the Balkans lost husbands, fathers, and sons. The Janissaries who died were Christians taken as children from their families, trained as Muslims, and forced to fight for the Sultan. Their deaths were tragedies compounded by their origins. The Sipahi cavalry who died left widows and orphans who lost not only family, but also the Timar land grants that supported them, causing economic hardship. The irregular troops and Christian vassals, forced to fight for the Ottomans, died in a war they had no stake in, killed because their rulers compelled them to invade. For Moldavia, the victory came at cost too. 4,000 to 8,000 dead meant every town and village lost people. But the Moldavians had won their survival, and that made the sacrifice meaningful in ways that Ottoman deaths were not. On January 10th, 1475, in the frozen hills of Moldavia, 40,000 men, led by Stephen the Great, faced 120,000 Ottoman invaders and destroyed them. The Ottomans attacked uphill through mud and snow against prepared defences. They failed. Stephen counterattacked from the flanks. The Ottoman army broke and fled. 40 to 45,000 Ottomans died, killed in battle, drowned in frozen rivers, frozen to death in forests, hunted down during the pursuit. It was one of the greatest Christian victories in medieval history. A battle that stopped Ottoman expansion, elevated Stephen to legendary status, and proved that Ottoman invincibility was a myth. The victory was won through superior tactics, defensive terrain, and the fury of men fighting for their homeland against an empire that had come to enslave them. Stephen the Great would fight dozens more battles, but Vaslui remained his masterpiece. The day 40,000 Moldavians annihilated 120,000 Ottomans in frozen hell. The frozen ground outside Vaslui was carpeted with Ottoman dead, and the rivers ran red with their blood. And Christian Europe, which had cowered before Ottoman power for decades, learned that the Ottomans could bleed, could be defeated, could be broken. In the frozen hell of Vaslui, Stephen the Great taught the Sultan that some small nations, led by brilliant commanders and defended by determined soldiers, could never be conquered. The dream of Ottoman expansion into Eastern Europe died in the mud and snow of Moldavia, killed by 40,000 warriors who refused to kneel.